These unconventional times require unconventional conversations. Listen in as your host, Richard Gordon, engages in one-on-one conversations with numerous leaders, elected officials, politicians, and others to learn what's happening in your state, on the Hill, and across America. Now, here's the host of Unconventional Times, Richard Gordon.
Hello, this is Richard Gordon, your host for Unconventional Times. Welcome to the program, and it's nice to have you here with us today. You know, Israel has been in the news pretty constantly since October 7th, 2023. And there's been a lot of concern in the United States and across the world for what is going on and when the hostages will be home. It's been over 500 days now, and a lot of people would like to know what is happening and what is the future of Israel. With me today is someone who is best able to speak to that. Ido Aharoni has been a diplomat, a writer, a speaker. He's been all over the world. He was a member of the diplomatic corps for over 25 years. I know him to be a lecturer across the United States and very much in demand. So if you want him, you better hurry up because he books up quickly. But is a great guest speaker. We are truly honored to have the ambassador with us today. Ambassador, welcome to Unconventional Times.
Thank you so much. The honor is all mine. Really, thank you.
Well, thank you. There are so many things we can talk about, but why don't we start with what's on everybody's mind, and that obviously is Gaza, and what is going on. Where do you think things stand today? I mean, we've had a ceasefire that is in phases. The first phase is over. Where are we, and where are we going? What can we expect?
So the problem hasn't really changed since 10/7, if you'd like, since the very beginning of this stage of the conflict, which was really the disengagement from Gaza in the summer of 2005, which was an Israeli unilateral pullout of all of its military forces, all of its civilians. And it's a question of who has the clout. Since 10/7, Hamas has a clear clout over Israel, and that is, of course, the hostages. In terms of purely, the tactics of negotiations, what Israel should have done on October 8th, and we can talk about why Israel didn't do that, but what Israel should have done on October 8th is to say, yes, we were defeated badly, but we recognize that this is a hostage-first situation, and therefore we propose a deal. The only deal on the table as far as Israel is concerned is all Palestinian prisoners for all Israeli hostages and the dead bodies. That's what Israel should have done on October 8th. Why it didn't happen? We can talk about it. There are many reasons, mostly psychological reasons.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I'm also interested in how many prisoners Israel is holding.
So at the time, it was over 10,000.
Oh my goodness.
Which is not really a large number when you consider, percentage-wise. We consider the number of people incarcerated in the United States, which is over 1% of the total population. So
it's over 2 million people. Yeah.
Yeah. So why it didn't happen is because it was very difficult for the Israeli leadership to admit that Israel was defeated on October 7th. And they were eager to turn the table on the Palestinians, which eventually we were able to do. After 14, 15 months of intense fighting, we were able to turn the table on Hamas. But we have to understand that the warfare, this is a confrontation that was imposed on Israel, but it's not your conventional, you can say it's a non-conventional warfare in the sense that Hamas is using tactics and tools that are not fair. They're using humans as people as human shields. They don't really care about the humanitarian crisis. Their entire methodology is designed to put public pressure on Israel. And so in that regard, Hamas is not about the well-being of the Palestinians, and you're fighting an enemy that is not only brutal when it comes to Jews and Israelis, but it's also brutal when it comes to the Palestinians themselves. And that's a huge obstacle. And I'm not familiar with any nation state in recent history that had to deal with what Israel is dealing with, both in Gaza and in Lebanon with Hezbollah.
Do you think Hamas would have made that deal?
No. But even if Hamas had said no, it would have completely changed the positioning of the conversation. Israel then would have had the upper moral ground. We are the ones who proposed the deal. We were generous. We admitted that we are in a tough spot. And then if Hamas had declined, which probably they would have done that. They would have declined the Israeli deal. It would have given Israel all the legitimacy in the world to go in and do what needs to be done.
So when we look at Israel, there's been a lot of controversy. There's been a lot of disagreement about how they handle the war. One of the things that comes up all the time, you talked about humanitarian aid. Why did Israel immediately bring in food? Why didn't it immediately bring in water? It almost looks to the outside world that they're holding back these essentials to life. Why
Yeah.
did they do it even just for to get the high road, as you spoke about it?
So there's a misunderstanding, a fundamental misunderstanding about how this confrontation is being viewed by Western liberal democracies and how it's being viewed by the Israelis. And here's the difference. In the eyes of the Western world, the war is between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is viewed as, at the end of the day, a small organization, maybe 50,000 members, that hijacked the Gazan system. Israel doesn't see it that way. Israel looks at Gaza as a rogue political entity, if you may, a state. And the war is not against Hamas. The war is against Gaza, the entire system, just as the Allied forces in World War II did not fight the Nazi Party. They fought Germany. And it was Germany that was defeated in the end. And the German people called the first day after the war ended day zero, meaning we have to start from scratch and build everything from scratch. This is how the Israelis see it. So the expectation that you will fight Gaza, this rogue state, and aid Gaza at the same time didn't seem to the Israelis as appropriate. And that's why there was a great deal of opposition, even from within the ranks of what you would call the more liberal political parties in Israel. So that's the source of this misunderstanding, the fundamental difference about as to the definition of who we're fighting.
That's really interesting, and comparing it to Germany is very interesting because after World War II, there was a Marshall Plan, with the United States and the Allies, but mostly the United States, rebuilt Europe. I mean, no one's going to dispute that. The United States came in and completely rebuilt a demolished Germany and a demolished Europe. Do you see that for Gaza? Has that been the plan for what happens with Gaza?
So first of all, as far as I can tell, there is no plan on the part of the Israeli government, which is very, very unfortunate. And the reason there is no plan is because of political constraints. It conflicts, it will collide with the very survival of the coalition, and therefore there is no plan. But if you ask me, that should be the plan. Absolutely, and you're right to mention the Marshall Plan, which not only did remarkably well rehabilitating Germany, transitioning Germany from a society that glorified violence, that tried to extinguish the Jewish people in an industrial fashion, but also Japan. Japan was a society highly militant, the same society that produced the attack on Pearl Harbor against all American conventional wisdom at the time. And they transitioned both of them into Western-style liberal pluralistic societies that are also pacifistic, anti-war, which is incredible.
Right.
So
Can't have a military.
It's an incredible success in terms of, but we have to remember that the Marshall Plan essentially was a matching fund. For every dollar that we bring in, you have to bring in. So the question is, who's going to bring the matching dollar on behalf of the Palestinians? And here, the assumption is that it will be the rich Arab countries, the oil countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and so on, and maybe even Egypt. I think all of it is in the hands of the U.S. administration. I don't think Israel is in any position to bring any Arab actors to the table, not even the UAE and Bahrain, with which we have the Abraham Accords. So it's really in the hands of the administration, of the U.S. administration, if you ask me. But
Do you think,
absolutely, that's the solution.
and do you think that the American administration is able to do that? Do they have the relationships with these countries to make that happen?
Yes, certainly the Trump administration has, and the Trump family, they certainly have the relationship with Saudi Arabia, perhaps more intimacy than we've seen before. And so they can deliver. Also remember that in the eyes of Trump, it's a continuation of the Abraham Accord, right? So
Right.
to bring in Saudi Arabia and to have as part of the deal the rebuilding of Gaza, I think would be a crowning achievement. So I think that Trump is highly motivated to make this happen. That's my view.
Why do you think the Biden administration couldn't do it?
They did not win the respect of the Arab world. I think it has a lot to do with the failure of the U.S. administration under Obama to understand the so-called Arab Spring. They were too eager to see the wings of democracy and freedom and liberty, and they were too quick to throw Mubarak under the bus.
Hmm.
And while everybody else in the Middle East knew, we all knew, and in fact, there were plenty of commentators that publicly and openly spoke about the danger of getting rid of Mubarak so quickly. And everybody knew that what would happen is that the rise of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. And so I think America lost a lot of credit. And then, of course, what happened in Syria under Obama, and the fact that he failed to meet his own red line, his own self-imposed red line. Nobody forced him to announce his red line. So I think that Biden paid the price for the failures of the Obama administration reading the situation in the Middle East.
So, as best as we can tell, there are 59 remaining hostages being held captive in Gaza. Some are living, some are not. How do they get home? What happens next? Who is the mediator here? I mean, it doesn't sound like the United States or Israel is negotiating directly with Hamas, but somebody is. Who would that be?
So you have to assume that at the end of the day, Israel has direct channels to talk to Hamas. That must be a working assumption. I'm talking about people on the Israeli side that can actually pick up the phone and call Hamas. You have to assume that this ability exists. And why do I say that? Because it existed before, even shortly before 10/7, there were conversations between Israeli officials and Hamas officials. So, but having said that, when you're dealing such a delicate situation, again, remember, Israel is in a built-in disadvantage. We don't have any leverage. They have the leverage because they're holding our people. And so we are entering this, and we need the help of mediators. In this case, it was Qatar, and in some cases, it was Egypt. The United States I think that the leverage that the United States has is that Hamas truly believes that Trump is capable of stopping the humanitarian aid. Now, you have to understand that the so-called humanitarian aid is a major lifeline of embattled Hamas. They control the medication, they control the food, they control the water, they control all the other resources. They benefit from it financially. We know it. We have evidence for it. And so that's
You
the
mean they
real
sell it to their own people? I mean, what are you saying they benefit?
yes, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Everything is ransom. There's a whole culture of ransom. And so they're afraid that Trump will put an end to it. They trusted that the Biden administration will not put an end to it. That's the whole story.
So when we see the trucks coming through, and sometimes they get held up at the border as they had this week, those trucks are necessary, I think what you're saying, for Hamas to use to fund itself. I mean, is that it? And their own people are buying the medical, the water, the food from their own people. Is that
Yeah,
largely what you're saying?
yes, absolutely. And we have evidence. Israel has plenty of evidence to support this claim.
One of the things that people ask all the time, that Americans ask all the time, and one of the things that I think Israel is extraordinarily proud of, is trading prisoners for deceased Israelis, that Israel leaves no one behind. A lot of Americans don't understand that concept, to release hundreds of terrorists in return for four, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, four dead Israelis. What's the mindset behind that?
So that's a part of the Israeli national ethos of mutual solidarity that comes from Judaism. One of the reasons Jews survived throughout the millennia, despite of thousands of years of persecution. If you think about it, all those who tried to eliminate the Jewish people, all those big super global powers are gone. Where are the Romans today, right? Where are the Egyptians or the Turks or the Spanish Inquisition, the Nazi Party? They're all gone, and the Jews are still here. What's the secret of the Jews' survival? And that's mutual solidarity. It's what we call in Yiddish landsmanship. It's
Right.
the fact that we came from the same village, or we come from the same culture, the same heritage. We have to take care of each other because otherwise we're not going to survive.
It's a large family.
It's a large family that survived against all odds. And so when you translate into the Israeli national ethos, when I send my kid to the army, I must be convinced 100% that whatever happens, the state of Israel will do its utmost to take care of me, to bring it back, to bring my child back. And the best example is the raid on Entebbe
Hmm.
in 1976. A lot of people don't know that, but it was not all Israelis. In fact, there were many Jews, European Jews, French Jews, Jews from North Africa on that airplane. They were not even Israeli citizens. And the state of Israel put its own soldiers at risk to rescue the Jews, not just Israelis, the Jews. And it's very, very important. When you read Israel's proclamation of independence, it pledges to defend Jews. When you look at Israel's law of return, which is the legal contract between Israel and the Jewish people, it's all about Israel seeing itself as a safe haven to all Jews or people of Jewish background. So it's not just about, technically being a citizen of the state of Israel. Israel exists as a solution to all Jews all over the world.
Throughout the diaspora. As I recall, in Entebbe, only one person died, correct?
Well, one soldier was
One
killed, and that
soldier,
was Yoni Netanyahu, but
right,
there were a couple of hostages that were killed. One of them was
as well.
a survivor whose name was Dora Bloch.
So President Trump has talked boldly about the United States taking over Gaza and turning it into the Mediterranean, like the Riviera or something like that. What do you think of that? What do people in Israel think of that?
So, it's a fantastic idea, and I say fantastic idea. The word fantastic comes from the word fantasy.
Hmm.
It's a fantastic idea that it's impossible to conceive this idea without the active participation of Americans and particularly American troops. Because who's going to supervise? Let's assume that this is going to happen. Who's going to supervise it? Who's going to protect the builders? The builders are going to rebuild Gaza. Who's going to provide with all the safety? Of course, you would need hundreds of thousands of soldiers to take care of that. It's going to be one of the biggest real estate projects in the world. You're talking about creating a home for 2 million people in a tiny piece of land.
But where do they go in the meantime? I mean, he's talking about, first of all, he said that they will have to leave, and then he said they're not coming back. So what happens there?
Well, I think that the original idea was to create some sort of a big high-end refugee camp in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. that will be remote, not close to any major Egyptian cities because it will be in the desert, so that the Egyptians will not be afraid of any influence that they could have, exporting their Islamic radicalism to Egyptian society. So I think that was the initial idea, and then you rebuild Gaza and you bring them back. Those of them would like to come back. But then the version changed, and they said, well, nobody's coming back. So I don't know how that's going to work. One thing for sure, the millions of Palestinians, whether they have a legitimate claim to be referred to as a people or not, it's irrelevant. They're here, and we have to deal with them. And unfortunately, it's Israel's problem. I think what Trump is trying to do, which is admirable, is to get the Arab world to develop some sense of responsibility for the Palestinians. Because so far, World War II created a massive global refugee problem. About 22 million refugees were created as a result of World War II, among them over 1 million Jewish refugees from Arab countries. All those refugees were settled in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Ukraine, and the Jews were settled in Israel. The only group that was not settled and grew exponentially from a couple of 100,000 refugees, now we have several million that claim to be refugees, are the Palestinians. And the reason is because there was no political will. And on the other hand, I'll say more than that, there was a deliberate attempt to exploit their hardships and their tough position for political purposes on behalf of the Arab world. So the Arab world is not only, accused of complacency, they deliberately did not solve the problem. So Trump comes along and he says, wait a second, you guys are responsible for the Palestinians' fate, for the fate of the Palestinian people, and therefore I expect you to pitch in to be part of the solution. And I think that's admirable. And I hope he succeeds. I hope he succeeds in that effort.
So yesterday, the president said to Hamas, release the prisoners or else. Release them immediately. And Hamas issued a statement last night or this morning saying that this is going to exacerbate things and lead to increased bloodshed and fighting in Gaza. Do you agree with that, or are they just saying that for their own purposes?
They're saying it for their own purposes. Look, if they wanted to stop the violence in Gaza, all they had to do is stop the war, give back the hostages, and leave Gaza. That would have ended everything. So they're a bunch of cowards and a bunch of hypocrites. But nevertheless, I think that Trump is threatening them with Israel's power, meaning when he says all hell will break loose, he doesn't mean I'm going to send American troops. He means I'm going to give a green light to the Israelis to go back in. Now that's easier said than done, because by now hundreds of thousands of Gazans returned to their home, or whatever's left of their homes. So for Israel to resume the military campaign is going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult, and
because a lot of people in harm's way. And I know Israel always goes out of their way. I had a friend whose son was in the IDF, and one of his jobs was to knock on doors to make sure that civilians get out. People don't understand that. They just don't know about it.
And Israel is also using technology to inform the enemy of their intent. So show me another army that is sending you text messages. I'm going to attack your neighborhood in an hour. Get out of there. There is no such precedent in modern warfare.
So you talked about the Abraham Accords. Where does it go from here? And, a lot of people thought that October 7th was a reaction to Saudi Arabia and Israel having better relations. Is that true? And where do the Abraham Accords go? And can there be an arrangement? I'm not going to say peace, but an arrangement between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
So there are three things to be said about that. First of all, what is the definition of peace in the Middle East? It's certainly not like the peace you have with Canada. It's a form,
I don't know how good that is anymore.
Yeah, it's still pretty good. It's still preferred over what we have with the Palestinians. But in the Middle East, when you say peace, you mean non-belligerency, some kind of a livable arrangement that allows us not to kill each other. That's peace in the Middle East. That's why everybody's talking about normalization and nobody's talking about peace. So that's the first thing to be said. The second, it's amazing that the Abraham Accords held post 10/7. You would think that with all the images of Israel's military action in Gaza, that the Arab governments will not withhold the pressure, the public pressure, and will cave in and return the ambassadors, close the embassies, and so on. None of that happened. Not only that, and that's the third thing to be said, the Saudis are still in it. The Saudis are still interested. What's the explanation? There are two explanations I think that are very valid. The first is that Hamas also killed scores of Muslims on 10/7. People forget that. They killed Arab Israelis. They killed other Muslims, Bedouins, that were working on that day in the music festival. They were driving buses and so on. Those videos, and they uploaded it as along with the other videos. Those videos were available on their special Telegram channel for about 2.5 weeks after 10/7. So enough time for Muslims, hundreds of millions of Muslims, to download those videos and watch them. And there were some horrible videos of people begging for their lives in Arabic. And Hamas doesn't believe them. Hamas is questioning them. To what extent you're familiar with the Quran? And the person is answering them, and it's not enough, and they shoot him. And you see it on video. That shocked the Muslim world, shocked Arab Israelis, for example. So that's the first explanation. The second explanation is that the Saudis' desire to normalize ties with Israel reflects a big strategic decision that they made, which is to transition their economy from natural resource-based economy to knowledge-based economy. Israel is the only potential partner for this transition in our region. It's the only knowledge-based economy in our region. And so therefore, for them, Israel is a strategic partner in something that they view to be the lifeline of the future of the kingdom, the ability to produce knowledge that matters. And I think that's the reason why they're still in it. And again, I go back to what I said before. I think that Trump is in a wonderful position to deliver a deal that will probably, potentially could be the crowning achievement of both of his presidencies, of both of his terms.
If I could shift you, let me ask you one further question before I shift you for a second. Iran. How does all this play out with Iran? With what went on with Hezbollah in the north, what's going on with Hamas in the south, with the Abraham Accords, with a possible Saudi-Israeli agreement. What happens with Iran going forward?
So here again, you have fundamental differences in the approach, which reflect different cultures. So the Israeli approach to Iran is that the main problem with Iran is the motivation of the regime. In other words, what is it that the Iranians believe in? What is it that they stand for? Because, they can develop nuclear weapons, but can also develop biological weapons. They can develop chemical weapons. So Israel's position is that you have to address the motivation. You have to address their anti-Western sentiment. That's the Israeli approach. The American approach is the smoke and gun approach. It's a legal approach that is well rooted in the Constitution. We can punish people for their intentions. We punish people only for their deeds. If you will show me a smoking gun, I can punish the Iranians. That's the big debate. And that's a debate that crosses political camps in Israel. So whether you had a left-leaning prime minister or a right-leaning prime minister, it didn't matter. That's how the Israelis see it. Iran should be taken seriously when they talk about their intentions. We must believe them. Why? Because of our history of thousands of years of persecution, we must believe our enemies when they say that they want to kill us. We must take them seriously. The Americans say our job is to prevent them from having a nuclear bomb. Israel says that's not the problem. That's the debate. Now, do I see a difference between Trump 47 to Biden or to Obama? Not really. None of them was interested and is interested in tackling the real issue, which is what the regime stands for. They're not interested. Maybe they believe that the Iranian system will implode from within, Maybe. I don't know. I've heard, I've been in diplomacy for 30 years. For 30 years, I've been hearing the same story. Oh, they're about to crumble. They're about to, implode. No, I don't think it's going to happen so quickly. But that's really the debate. And I really don't think that Trump is interested in deploying any military against Iran. I don't think he's interested in allowing Israel to deploy any military against Iran. That's my assessment.
Let me switch things for a minute. Before October 7th, 2023, Israel was going through an upheaval, I guess is the best way to put it. There are people demonstrating in the streets, there are people who are very upset with the government. Obviously, after October 7th, things came back together again to some degree. I guess my question is, are the Israeli people divided? Are they supporting the the cabinet as it is? I mean, where are they? Because things changed obviously dramatically after October 7th, but it was a country greatly divided beforehand. Where is it now?
Yeah, and the division was over the type of democracy Israel will become. So you have you have to assume that all governments, all politicians, always want to have unrestricted power. There are politicians that are fully aware of their ability to garner more and more unrestricted power, yet they self-restrict themselves, right? So they're self-restrained. Like David Ben-Gurion was like that. He also wanted to have unrestricted power, but he understood the rules of the game. And Menachem Begin was like that. He understood, of course, he wanted to have unrestricted power, but he self-restrained. And what you're seeing now, and I think that those little devils have a lot to do with it. What you're seeing now all over the world, political leaders, I wouldn't even use the word leaders, political technocrats, who just shamelessly and openly aspire for unrestricted power. Their understanding of democracy is that winner takes it all. They don't understand democracy in a nuanced, complex way. And I think that what you're seeing is democracy is falling victim to the inability to engage in a complex, nuanced conversation about anything. It's black and white, binary view of reality. The demonization of the other side. If you disagree with me, I want you to be canceled. And that's what you're seeing. And that's what you're seeing in Israel. So it's not a real division. It's not a real ideological division. There are very few people that really understand the issues at hand. But what you have is a small group of Israeli technocrats who are hell-bent to gain unrestricted power. That's the story. They want to have unrestricted power, and they don't really care about the implications of it.
Is that what the riots were about? Was that what the demonstrations were about?
The demonstrations were against the attempt to give the government no checks and balances. That's what
Right.
and Israel to begin with was established with a very weak system of checks and balances, unlike the United States. And so the situation in Israel is really dangerous. We can slip very quickly from a democratic pluralistic system to an authoritarian regime very quickly. And that's what the Israelis were doing. There's a strong majority in Israel against the attempts of the government to acquire unrestricted power. Most Israelis think it's going to be a disaster.
So will we see an election soon? I mean, Netanyahu has been in power for, well, you know better than me, but quite some time.
Right.
Will
And,
the
and,
election
this,
soon?
and Mr. Netanyahu was able to survive exactly because of his political willingness to give his coalition partners whatever they wanted in a way that no other prime minister in Israel's history would have done. Not Menachem Begin, not Ariel Sharon. Nobody would have done what Netanyahu did for the sake of his own survivability and his own coalition survivability. There's no question about it. That's the
Which
secret.
pushes the country sharply to the right, I assume.
It's not even about right or left anymore. It's about political power, about what do I have to do in order to survive, and survivability is above all. That's the story. That's
So will
the
the
story.
so
Yeah,
will
and
the
there is no plan. I mean, it's not
right.
there's a vision. I want to survive because I want to achieve this or I want to achieve that. None of that. I want to survive for the sake of survival.
Right. So I stay in power.
Yeah, and there is no precedent to that in Israel's short history of almost 80 years of independence. We have never seen anything like it, and I think that Israelis are very tired of it. And I think that you will see probably in 2025. I think this government will not be able to hold. This coalition is not going to be able to hold. Certainly, if Trump will be introducing a Saudi deal, because the Saudis will demand some sort of political horizon for the Palestinians. This coalition, this current far right coalition, will not be able to accept it. Plus, it seems to me they have two major hurdles to pass. One will be the budget, and the second will be the question of the military draft and the ultra orthodox. So I think that sometime in 2025, this coalition will expire and we'll go to national elections. What could happen? Anything could happen in early national elections, but I think that there's a certain fatigue in the Israeli public from this current government.
Who emerges in the opposition? There's so many people in the cabinet who are opposed to him, but who emerges to take him on?
So the names, we've been there before. We've seen many names, and so everybody's talking about Naftali Bennett.
Right.
He served for a very brief moment as prime minister. He was actually a pretty good manager. He managed the affairs of the country pretty well, but he was a very bad politician. He couldn't hold his own tiny party intact, and he selected the wrong people, and showed very poor political judgment throughout his short career. So I don't know if he will rise to the occasion. And you always have the other names, Benny Gantz and Avigdor Lieberman and Gadi Eisenkot and Yair Lapid and all those guys. I don't know. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. Never underestimate Mr. Netanyahu's political skill. He is the most skilled and most experienced politician around. And he shows every time. He's also the best campaigner around. So anytime we go into an election season, Mr. Netanyahu enjoys an advantage because that's his comfort zone. That's what he does best. He's actually a great campaigner.
Couple quick questions that are important. You travel a lot around the United States. You meet with a lot of people. You speak constantly and to a lot of groups. There's been a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism in the United States. People are more concerned now than I have ever seen in my lifetime. What do you attribute that to? Is that what you're seeing when you're out there? And is this an American experience? It seems to be more of a worldwide experience.
So I think that there's a worldwide rise in the number of hate crimes, and it has a lot to do with the rise of social media and the fact that people can hide behind the anonymity that social media gives them. And in some cases, people just transcend the online violence to in-person physical life violence. And so that's one explanation. Here in America, I think the story is more complex. I think that the Jews were labeled by the social justice movement as the new white privilege elite. That's the story. And people completely forgot the history of persecution. People forgot that only less than a century ago, Jews were severely restricted in this country. And they're pushing us in the name of inclusion, by the way. They're excluding the Jews. And I'm talking about the social justice warriors. Many of them are Jews themselves. And so Israel fell victim to the success or the rise of the social justice movement. I think that one of the reasons Mr. Trump is back in the White House is because rank and file Americans are afraid of that. And you see that in the backlash to this whole DEI culture. DEI is a perfect example of a good idea, right? Diversity is a good idea originally, that slowly became a very bad idea. How do you end up excluding people in the name of inclusion beats me, but that's exactly what's happening. And I think that this is a big part of what you see. a big part of what we consider to be a rise in anti-Semitism is because Jews are being viewed today as, you know, the elite, the bad actors, and the populists are targeting them.
From the Jewish groups you speak with, do you hear a lot of this? Is this what people are talking about?
So yes, and keep in mind that I speak to Jews and Christians that care about Israel. So I
Mhm.
don't really get a chance to speak to people that don't care about Israel. That Israel is not central to their lives. Even when I talk to my students, whether on the West Coast, on the East Coast, or even my students in Israel, um, they know that I'm an Israeli, and therefore they understand the centrality of Israel to my conversation.
Of course.
So people are respectful, but I don't really know. I don't speak to people that don't care about Israel. That's not my audience.
Right, right. Understood. Look, we're way over time. You've been very generous with your time, but I cannot let you go without asking you two questions that are somewhat related. You have such deep roots in Israel. Your family goes way back in Israel. You had recently told me a story about your dad and the founder of the country, David Ben-Gurion. I'd love to have you tell that again about your dad's relationship. I mean, it would be like an American knowing George Washington. I mean, it's just amazing. That,
Yeah.
and then I've one after that.
Well, keep in mind that a lot of people knew Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion was very accessible. He lived in the heart of Tel Aviv at the time, and his wife was inviting people in to have tea with Mr. Ben Gurion. She called him Ben Gurion. So Ben Gurion was a very special guy. It was a different time. And yeah, my dad got to know him because my father was helping. My father was working for the trade union, and the trade union was very big on developing educational programming for the workers in the factories. And Ben Gurion used to meet with them and discuss the Torah portion of the week on a Friday morning. And my father's job was to bring the workers. They would come from all over the country with buses. But, you know, I don't think he was too close to him. I just think that, he knew him, but he was a great admirer of Ben Gurion. And I read a lot about Ben Gurion myself, and I know his family. I know his grandsons. Alon Ben Gurion, his grandson, is a very close friend of mine. And the more I read about Ben Gurion, the more I'm convinced that Ben Gurion was a genius. And he made lots of mistakes. Don't get me wrong. He was a human being. I mean, he made lots of mistakes, and he had many faults. But the more you read about him, the more you're convinced the fact that he was able to taught himself languages. He had a different level of intellectual capacity in his understanding of the world. And I urge all of our listeners and viewers to watch the movie Ben Gurion Epilogue, which is about his style of leadership. One of the best documentaries that came out of Israel ever. It was made by Yariv Moser and Yael Perlov, both of them dear friends of mine from Tel Aviv University. It's a great documentary, Ben Gurion Epilogue. You can find it online. It's a must watch. And of course, Israel had many other great leaders. I
Well,
greatly.
you worked for one. I want to talk about that. It's my last question. Shimon Peres. I mean, you worked
Right.
for one of the
So I was Uri Savir. Uri Savir was Israel's chief negotiator with the Palestinians. Uri was selected for the job by Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin when he was only 41 years old, and I was his assistant, and I was 30 years old. And it was a great experience, and I got a chance to witness Shimon Peres at work and his entire team. Shimon Peres was surrounded by a very, very good group of people. And of course, that brought me to the White House and, Bill Clinton and the signing ceremony in September of 1993. And it was quite an experience. That experience happened early on in my diplomatic career, and it kind of led me to believe that my entire career is going to be that, on that
yeah, at
level,
that level.
which of course didn't happen. But I learned a great deal, and Shimon Peres was a very special person. On top of the fact that he was the most intellectually curious political leader I've ever seen. Um, he had this rare work ethics that people don't really appreciate. Not a lot of people talk about it, but Shimon Peres would accomplish in one day what other politicians that I worked with would accomplish in a week or two. He would accomplish in one day because he had such work ethics. He could work for 20 hours straight,
Mm.
and no exaggeration. and he would exhaust all the people around him. And I've never seen anything like it. And he was always creative. He was always sharp. He always had great ideas, and he was really about the well-being of the people, the well-being of the country. He was really not about himself. That's what I liked about him. So yeah, I've been blessed to meet people that I could learn from, and people that could be great mentors to me.
An amazing history and amazing future. I'm going to ask you one last thing. I said that was the last thing, but look, I actually was on your website, which is one of the best websites I've ever seen. I mean, it's
Oh,
really
thank you.
comprehensive. How do people find you? People who are
Um,
listening, people who are watching, how are they going to find you?
just Google my name, idoaharoni.com. It will come up, and I'm happy to talk to anybody. I'm happy to lecture and invite people to my lectures. I teach at Turo. I teach at Tel Aviv U. I'm a guest. I'm a visiting lecturer here in San Diego, and I'm happy. I'm happy to engage those who want to know more about Israel, the Middle East, and so on.
Well, you've had an amazing career and miles to go before you sleep. So
Thank
really,
you. Thank you.
I appreciate all you do. I appreciate your being on our show. And as I say to my guests as we end, Ambassador Ido Aharoni, stay unconventional. So
Thank you. Thank you.
thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Well, that was an interesting conversation. I know I learned a lot about Israel and the future, and it gives me a lot of hope. But we can never forget. We can never forget. There are still hostages and there are still families waiting for their loved ones to come home. And it is very important that we never forget that. And we keep talking about it because this is important. And when you stop talking about things like this, it fades away. And these are people who, for no fault of their own, were taken into captivity and have been held for an unimaginable over 500 days. So please keep the hostages in mind. And please join us again when we have another really unconventional conversation. Thanks for joining us today.
You've been listening to Unconventional Times with your host, Richard Gordon. Check out all of the episodes of Unconventional Times on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. To learn more about Richard Gordon and all of his unconventional conversations, head on over to unconventionaltimes.com. Thanks for listening.